silenced as well. So I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Brandon Bretl. He comes to us with an education in fine art and chemistry. He spent about 3 years teaching English in Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, and then settled down momentarily in Kansas working as a math and science teacher. These experiences radically changed his context understanding and encouraged him to pursue a PhD in developmental psychology. He is now a professor at the University of Texas at Tyler, where he conducts research and teaches the intersections of social and political psychology, adolescent development, and science education. We're thrilled to have him here. Please welcome Dr. Brandon Bretl.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
It was working before.
Let's see.
Just click onto the presenter slide.
Just try to click. There we go. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I was excited when I got invited to do this and honored. I have been trying to get involved in CASA for the past couple of years, but I haven't been in one state long enough to do it. So I was in Kansas when I first started looking into it, and then moved to Wisconsin, reached out to them there, then left Wisconsin to come here to Texas, and then without reaching out, you all reached out to me. So that was really exciting for me. So to get right into it, we'll talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and child development. And here's what we'll talk about. So we'll go over the hierarchy of needs. I have two sort of tangents that will go on related to attachment theory and then shame and guilt. We'll talk about those and how those relate. And then I'm going to give you a little neuroscience, and then we'll talk about experience expected states. And then I'll try to bring that all in together for you. So I think you'll see my background as a teacher come out in this. So try not to be too pedantic, but probably going to come out. So just a little background on Maslow. He's an American psychologist. What is interesting about him is he really focused on mentally healthy people, really not on abnormal psychology or when things go wrong. He was really interested in how does it go right? How do you create mentally healthy people? What do their lives look like? What are the conditions that produce that? And this is the hierarchy of needs. So at the bottom, you have physiological needs, then safety needs, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. So we'll go through each of these, but the real point of this is that to be able to consider one of the higher needs, the prior ones need to be taken care of. So it makes your safety needs are meaningless if you don't have water, right? You will cross a minefield to get water if you need it, right? You're not going to be too concerned with safety if you need water. So the idea is that each of these is necessary to be able to address the next one. So starting with physiological needs, it's really quite simple: physical, material, biological. And you may have noticed also here is reproduction. This is one that tends to throw people off and is a bit of a debate in the field as well. But when we think about reproduction, the reality is by puberty, people have a sex life. That's just the way biology works. And it's the case, so even if, for example, somebody is not sexually active, sex is a motivating factor in their lives. And that's for all people. So the real point here is that it's possible by this point, puberty, it's possible for sexual dysfunction to hinder progress to the next stages. So just like polluted water, you can have water, but polluted water is going to hinder your progress to the next stages. Some form of sexual dysfunction could hinder progress to those next stages. So now that I've made everybody uncomfortable by talking about sex, we've got that out of the way, we can move on. So that's really the point here, is that it can interfere with things like safety, love and belonging, and self-esteem. Moving up then to safety needs, we're talking about things like personal security, health. Access to health care is a big one. Just recognition that if something does go wrong, am I going to be able to have access to health care? And then just other material resources that are necessary for a secure environment. And this really becomes an issue when there is chronic insecurity. So chronic insecurity will hinder cognitive development, and these are physiological processes. These can lead to internalizing and externalizing disorders. So internalizing disorders are things like depression. Externalizing would be things like fighting, things like that. So all of this is really related to health, cortisol levels. So chronic insecurity, when that is happening again and again and again consistently, those elevated cortisol levels, that elevated stress response will create cognitive deficits. It'll actually interfere with brain development that would be difficult. So our stress response is great. The best example I know of is like if you are in the woods and there's a bear, it's really good to have the stress response. You want that flight or fight response to kick in. And this was a really powerful, I listened to a talk by somebody and she said, but what if the bear comes home every night? So that's a really terrible situation to be able to, and get that chronic, consistent, elevated cortisol levels can have really negative effects. And then specific traumas too. So if there is a major incident, cases of sexual physical abuse, some sort of major accident or things like that, post-traumatic stress disorder, things like that can be an issue there as well. So let's say we have our physiological needs met, our safety needs are met. We can really then start experiencing love and belonging. So this is, friendship, intimacy, family, a sense of connection. I like to think of it as multi-tiered and concentric. So meaning that, we have our tight-knit family groups. All of that is within a group of friends. All of that is within a community. All of that is within a, county, within a state, within an, things like that. So there are all different levels of belonging that we can feel. Unique meaning at different stages of life. So sense of belonging for a child is going to be different for an adult, but it is relevant nonetheless. I would argue that it's especially relevant for young children, and that's going to lead us into our first sidebar, which is attachment theory. And I forgot to mention too, if you have any questions or things you want to mention, feel free to interrupt me. I spend all my time really on this theoretical side. You all have lived experiences and have been working in CASA. So if there's a story that comes to your mind that is relevant to this, feel free to interrupt me. I think we'll have plenty of time. Yeah.
It's more along the lines of definition. When you say like you need to have certain needs met, like physiological needs met before you proceed to safety or vice versa.
Yeah.
What is the definition of like having needs met? It's like fully, completely, or for the most part, or like safe, safety needs, health, like what it generally, like you're healthy, but maybe you have asthma or something like that. Like what does it mean that your needs are met? What does that mean before you go?
That's a really good question. I think I would use a definition in terms of, is it causing disorder? So just like if we're talking about mental disorders, we'll all have certain things where we're issues. It doesn't become a disorder until it starts interfering with our optimal, engagement socially with ourselves, things like that, and mental health. So certain things like the physiological level, at that most basic level, if you don't have water, you will die. So I mean that's kind of, so you need to have clean water. At the same time, you could have, polluted water. You're going to survive. You're not going to thrive. Things like that.
So you could have a disabled person who has some kind of disability, whatever it is, and they could essentially progress.
Yeah.
On that.
Yeah. And I think it'll always be, life is just messy. It'll always be on a spectrum. There'll always be shifting kind of how those needs are met and to what degree. And I think the takeaway is that they need to be met in some form or another adequately to not cause a disorder to be able to go to the next stage. That's a good question. Thanks. So attachment theory here, this is really from biology, and it really is just based on the fact that certain offspring require a caregiver. So for example, sea turtles lay their eggs in the sand, they go out to sea. From that point on, those sea turtles are on their own. Other animals don't. So ducklings, elephants, humans, the survival of our offspring requires that we are there to take care of them until a certain point. So the idea here is that psychologically, we are biologically primed to attach to our caregivers. And major takeaways from that is that if you have secure attachments, meaning that if your needs are met when you need them, that can lead to things like increased confidence, independence. So if you have a child who's very clingy, it's most likely that they have just not had their needs met. They are afraid of not having their needs met. So you'll often see that if their needs aren't met at home, when they get to school, they'll be very clingy to the teacher. Things like that. And then increased achievement is a correlate of secure attachments. Insecure attachments, and the psychological literature on this stuff is really, they get pretty complicated with this. And but there's avoidant, resistant, disorganized. Those can lead to things like fearfulness, just sadness, anxiety disorders, again, clinging, rejecting, confused, angry, all of those things. One that's really interesting is avoidant. So resistant and disorganized are pretty obvious. It's just the caregiver is resistant to give care. Disorganized is just inconsistent care. It's just sometimes they get what they need, sometimes they don't. Avoidant is interesting in that it is a recognition by the child that the adult needs come first. And if they want their needs met, they need to do certain things or not do certain things to have those needs met. So a lot of times this manifests as emotional disorders where the children are afraid to feel their emotions. It's like, I can't get upset about this because that's going to turn my caregiver away and I'm not going to get what I need. So a lot of times this avoidant attachment style can result in children sort of burying those emotions, not being able to really express themselves or feel comfortable expressing themselves. Yeah.
We had a recent really good example of that. We had a teenager who did sex traffic. And so our advocate said, what do you like? And she said, oh no, I'm not allowed to have any of this.
Oh, yep. That's really it. Yeah. Yeah. And I could see that as that's an example. Another interesting thing about attachment theory is that stuff that happens in really early childhood, there are direct correlations with then how they approach adolescent relationships. So once they want to start getting into romantic relationships, they'll bring whatever was happening to them in their original relationships with their caregiver. They'll sort of bring that as normal into their adolescent relationships. So adolescents detach from their primary caregivers, they seek romantic attachments, and those issues that were in childhood, they can reemerge in adolescent intimate relationships. So it could be that, for example, that clinginess or that dependence and things like that. Okay, so those first three are really contained within attachment theory, so that the physiological needs, the safety needs, love and belonging, all of those are somewhat related to attachment theory, and attachment theory is a huge body of research. There's a lot of work on that. Once we have all of those things, we can get into some of the uniquely human things in Maslow's hierarchy, starting with esteem. So those are things like respect, self-esteem, recognition, strength, freedom, all of those things. And the one thing here related to this, I think there are three facets. So we have identity, self-concept, and self-esteem. And the way I like to think of identity is it's really something at the deepest core of who we are. So even young children begin forming an identity, and a lot of it is subconscious. We might not even be able to express explicitly how we identify in certain ways, but through psychological experiments, we can actually tease out differences in different identities that people have internalized. So identity is something very, very deep. It is very much connected to, with their like social and cultural and racial demographics. So, and it's so important that children can form a sense of identity that they're proud of. So what it doesn't matter, you're white, black, Mexican, they need to be able to be that and be proud of being that. That can be really important. Self-concept is something more superficial. Self-concept is really how you would describe yourself. How do you, if you were to describe yourself, you would describe your self-concept. And then self-esteem is an evaluative judgment of that self-concept. So it's like you have this concept of yourself. What do you believe about that? Is that good or bad? And the better you think it is, the more self-esteem you have. And I think this is a good place for another tangent here into differences between shame and guilt. And the influence that has. So shame, in a psychological sense, is really directed at the self. So shame, we feel shame when we feel that there's something wrong with us. Guilt is directed at the behavior. So shame is there's something wrong with me. Guilt is I did something wrong. Okay? And these are really connected with very different outcomes. So shame can be ostracizing. It has physiological effects. Actually, there's research where they took people who had HIV, and they could predict the rate of T cell decline, the immune cell decline, based on the amount of shame they felt around the disease. So the more shame they felt, the more rapidly the disease sort of took over. So there are really strong physiological effects of feeling shame. And we can get in a little deeper even into this. The fact that it's ostracizing. Okay, I've got a question for you. For our evolutionary past, for our ancestors, we had to take that entire chunk of time. What would be the single greatest threat to our reproductive success? Single greatest threat to reproducing or being?
I think shame would be,
Shame? Okay.
because it's more internalized.
Yeah.
And I think that if you feel deep shame for yourself,
Yeah.
that you're not going to want to reproduce.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Yeah, I'm thinking something more superficial though. If it was just sort of one single thing that was the greatest threat to our reproductive success from caveman time till now.
Nurtured after the birth, so
Okay.
even leading up to like the conception.
Being
Because I would think nutritional content first,
okay,
but
starvation.
yeah, but beyond that, it's the amount of care and effort it takes to successfully
Yeah.
raise an offspring to adulthood.
That's true. Yeah.
Are you asking like an event in the history of time?
What is the thing? So like starvation. What would be the greatest threat that would be consistent from caveman time until now? The greatest threat to our reproductive success.
If you're on Zoom, feel free to unmute and join in or drop a response in the chat. We want you to participate as well.
Yeah.
Maybe like illness or disease.
Yep.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
Something.
Yep. Yeah, these are all so usually get like starvation, illness, disease, wild animals, injury, like natural disaster, things like that. I would argue that really ostracism, because all of those things, you're going to lessen the impact if you're part of a group, a part of a well-knit group, and you have people to rely on. So I would argue that the single greatest threat to our reproductive success would be ostracism, being kicked out of the group. So we would predict then that we have some really strong psychological biases to remain part of the group. And there's really to explain a lot of our political division, things like that. Has anybody tried to convince somebody who disagrees with them politically? Anybody tried that before? How did it go? No, it's impossible. We have, and really, so that would be predicted by this. The idea is that we have some really strong psychological mechanisms to maintain our in-group status, to the point where we will disregard direct evidence, literally with our own eyes, and disregard it if it means that we would be ostracized from our in-group, if we consider, a political group or something like that. So we have these very strong psychological biases to remain a part of our group, and ostracism can be really detrimental to that, and then leads to shame. So that I would say, like the idea where shame comes in is that we have the ability to feel shame. Because some people don't. You would have a disorder where you just don't feel shame. And you need to be able to, first of all, the group has to have the ability to ostracize, kick somebody out, and then that person has to have that ability to feel shame and be ostracized on a psychological level. So even if they're not physically removed, they can be sort of psychologically removed. Okay, so yeah, shame lead to a lot of internalizing symptoms, things like depression, anxiety disorders, things like that. Oftentimes correlated with physical and sexual abuse. I think one of the reasons this is that children have a hard time believing that adults can do anything wrong. So what happens is if it feels wrong, they're being abused, feels wrong, there must be something wrong with me. Because they've got to be doing something right, there must be something wrong with me. So a lot of times children can internalize that and it results in shame. Now, guilt, on the other hand, is a pro-social emotion. So guilt, if you are more guilt prone, you will have an easier time in life. It's correlated with positive outcomes in life. Because really what that is, what guilt is a motivation to repair relationships. So it's often correlated with secure attachments. So children who have secure attachments, they're comfortable in making mistakes. They can recognize that, okay, I can do something that's wrong, but that doesn't make me bad. I have that freedom and space to do that and say I'm sorry and regain that relationship. So typically guilt-prone individuals, that's correlated with positive outcomes. Now you can get into this area where you have, really what's important is that it's shame-free guilt, that they can feel, that they can separate the behavior from themselves and have that opportunity. Okay, so all these are met, we can get to the self-actualization stage. And that really simply is just the desire to improve oneself. And so whether that's in your career, whether that's towards a specific, sports ambition in the Olympics, whether that's in being a wife or a husband or a partner, and that desire to improve oneself, all of those prior stages need to be met before we can really actualize, self-actualize, put into practice those things that are going to improve ourselves. So one of the things to recognize here is that this is for all ages. Self-actualization isn't a goal for adults. It really happens at all ages. So if all of these needs are met for a toddler, they'll be in that self-actualization stage. They'll have that desire to improve themselves. Newborn infants, they have, it looks very different than adults, but that wanting to crawl, wanting to learn how to walk, wanting to eat food, all of those, for an infant, that's a desire to improve oneself. And then it changes, and toddlers will want to be in that self-actualization stage, young children in that self-actualization stage, and then teenagers and adults in that self-actualization stage. So it'll look different for the different age groups, but the important thing is that it's relevant for all these. A lot of times people think that it's like, okay, self-actualization is that thing we're aiming for when they're adults. No, they need to be in that state through all stages of development to avoid a deficiency. Okay, any questions on that? We're making really good time here. Yeah.
Identity really is a big challenge for our kids. They've been removed from their family. They're put in a residential center. They're in a foster home. There may be cultural issues. Did I cause this? Can you speak a little bit more in depth to that?
Yeah, in terms of my practical applications, I'm maybe lacking. Maybe some of you have some experience from a theoretical point of view. Any opportunity you can have to help them connect with their identity will be good. So if they are from Mexico, being able to in some way or another express and connect with their heritage, where they come from, who they are, I think that'll be good. And that's for any person. The deeper that they can dig into who they are and where they come from and be proud of that, and that I think that is going to be a benefit.
So ways to do that could be, if you have an African-American child that's been placed in a home that has no idea how to care for their hair.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Making sure they have that hair care,
right,
and someone that either educates the foster parents or a place to take them so that those needs are met.
Yep.
It also goes to the extent of their religion, a home that they come from of a certain religion, like if, for example, they were Catholic. Mm-hmm. And so you want to make sure that they have availability to a Catholic church. And those are just some examples.
Yep, I completely agree. Yeah, I think that those would be great examples. And the more you can support them in recognizing that there are people like you, you belong, and you need to be proud of who you are and where you come from. That's really going to be the core of it. Anything else before we get into the neuroscience, fun stuff?
Just an observation.
I've never really put this part together that way, but we often, the parents of our kids, of our CASA children, are working services. And we tend to want them to pick themselves up and do the right thing, get that self-actualization thing when they're down on the first two runs.
Mhm.
And we get frustrated with them. And it's like, okay, then we still have to have those expectations, but they need help in working their way up that pyramid
Yep.
before they can get there.
Right, absolutely. I think that would be a major obstacle because it'll be very hard for parents to support a child to the self-actualization stage if they're not there themselves. And I'm familiar with a little bit of research on this. I was doing work in Kansas on the maternal depression screening grant that they had. And part of that project, they had just these open-ended interviews for families in Kansas where anybody in Kansas could log in and just write a story about a really high time in their life or a really low time in their life. So I used a text analysis tool to plot the degree of positivity in those posts that they had. And we had their economic status, so their income levels. And there was an almost one-to-one direct correlation with the amount of positivity and their income. And there are other studies that show like just sometimes it's just $1,000 that another $1,000 a month to really shift that dynamic in the house. So again, in terms of how do you do that? If you don't have $1,000 a month to give the family, it's a really challenging situation. I personally, I don't have any specific recommendations, but how much access do you typically have with the parents in interaction with the parents?
It depends on the case.
Mm.
But, and the parents, if they want, how much they want. But that aside, there is a program in town that has been taking these families and putting them in they have to volunteer for it, but it's a fairly new program where that Family Counts program, where they bring them in and kind of work with them on some of these other things. I mean, now I see why it could be very beneficial.
Yeah.
Because then they have the support of that team.
Mm-hmm.
And so it may not be the group they started with, but it's hopefully a healthier group that can help them work their way.
Yeah, I think that's key. I think, again, if the parent isn't there, it's going to be very hard for them to help the child get there. So I think any sort of program to get the parents there as well and offer those supports is highly beneficial. Anything on Zoom? Anybody else have anything before?
Just a little question, it may be a silly one, but when like say, for example, like the parents and they get to this point, but then they have a setback, like does that start completely over and now we're back at the bottom, they have to build themselves back up? Or does sometimes this?
I would say probably not, because as you're going through things, you're going to be building resilience. You'll have experience with different things. So typically the second time you get knocked down, you're going to be better ready to cope with it. So I think that in terms, but the Maslow's hierarchy is still going to stay, like they're still going, you're not going to be able to get to those other ones until you rebuild from the bottom. You know what I mean? So I think that the hierarchy stands in that sense.
But the resilience.
I think so. And that's going to depend on the person and the specific circumstances.
We do actually have something to add from Zoom. This is Ashley and/or Daniel.
This is Ashley. So I love this. I'm a high school psychology teacher, so this is like right in my vein here. But I wanted to bring up both attachment and Maslow's, because as far as, which you know this, but with students, often, like, you can't really achieve educational goals if they come to school and they're more concerned about being hungry or tired, or you have to achieve the bottom tiers before education becomes even relevant to them. But I've also found that if parents fail as that child's, I guess, self-actualization role model, a lot of times they'll attach themselves to someone else. And often that's the teacher, because that's the most frequent adult other than their parents. So the teachers can actually be extremely valuable for CASAs, because they may be the adult that they're connected to, that they're attached to.
That's an excellent point. And it just takes one person in a child's life. It just takes that one role model. And that's actually backed by research too. And it shows that having one role model in your life can drastically change the outcomes. And the real issue there then gets to be setting boundaries, because you have to, you're limited as a CASA, the teacher is limited. And so you have to have a very clear sense of boundaries, what you can do and what you can't do. But in terms of being that mentor and being that role model, that is something that can go a long way. Excellent. Yeah.
So to that point, I mean, we as advocates don't have that much frequent access to the kids as does like a teacher or a coach. So it sounds like if we fulfill that role for them, then frequency of contact becomes critical.
I would say so, yes. And I would say even if you're having less frequent interactions with the child, ask them who they might look up to, or who is somebody in your life that you like and look up to, or who do you feel you could go to with a problem, things like that. And maybe just encourage them to take advantage of that resource and just get them to, who's your favorite teacher? Okay, well, when this happens, go to your favorite teacher and let them know about it, and things like that. So I could see that being very helpful. Yep.
We do have a question on Zoom talking about Maslow's and the hierarchy, that whenever you're having conversation with other adults or educators, that sometimes they think that you're just making excuses for a child, or talking about those lower rungs of the pyramid. What's the best approach to get other adults to understand this information, I guess its implications on behavior and results?
That's a really good question and a challenging one. I think.
You want to think on it and then come back for the
No, I think,
the end.
no, yeah. I might need to, but yeah, I would say. Well, I think it's related to there's this idea of resilience, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and things like that. Grit is one of the words that we hear a lot now, things like that. And the research on that is mixed, and it just, because there are so many other factors that go into these things. So I would say on the surface, Maslow's hierarchy is really, in some ways, pretty obvious. It's kind of like, yeah, you need water before you can do these other things. So I think, I wonder if, I don't know if really like situations where you'd be trying to convince somebody of Maslow's hierarchy in particular, but I could see the situation where you're using that to say like, hey, we need to get these things in place first, and convincing them of that. Sorry, I don't have a better solution, but I think, yeah, I guess it's just a matter of, grit can only get you so far, and that, and children, I mean, really adults are responsible for themselves and children are not. They've really, at any stage in a child's development, even through late adolescence, they are in training to be adults. They don't have the tools that are necessary to do what adults do and solve problems like adults, pull themselves up and be responsible for themselves. If they did, they would just be adults. So I think just kind of recognizing that all children, even through late adolescence, and it's socially and culturally dependent too. I mean, if we were in a culture where you go through an initiation ceremony when you're 12 and take on adult responsibilities, we could expect adult responsibility, expect adult level behavior from a 16-year-old. That's perfectly possible. But in our current culture, adolescence is really extended through the late 20s. So all the way up and for better or for worse, I don't know. But it's true. It really is. So just recognizing that there are going to be certain supports that everyone needs through those stages is important.
I do want to make a comment. Part of our relationship with that child is we stand in the gap between the parents that aren't in a position to do it and having no one. And so, like, if you're meeting with the school per se, and your child has had a problem, and they're saying, well, you're just taking up for the child. I think that as a CASA, we need to take a deep breath and say, yes, I am. And saying, help those other people understand, because I dare say most of them have never been alone as a child and know that scared feeling and not having someone on your side. And it's not that we don't want them to have consequences for whatever may happen, but the kids need to know that we stand with them, even if there's some guilt to go around.
Right.
That we're going to be there with them and bear that. And it doesn't have to be, I've blown it again, the shame.
Yeah, right. Yep. Yeah, and that'll be the key, kind of working with them, working with administration or the counselor, and if we need to address, and they're almost certainly going to be, again, Maslow is really concerned with what goes right. What is it when it goes right? This is what happens. So most children know it hasn't all gone right. So there's going to be some deeper psychological issues, maybe disorders, things like that need to be addressed. And helping the administration recognize that, the school counselor recognize that, and then being that advocate for them.
That's a lot easier said than done. Some of my most frustrations have been in the academic world with my kids. I don't know why, but I have done exactly, I've had to experience that, and where I got, talked down to and told whatever, because this person just needs to, this child just needs to learn to respect. Well, it's a little more than that.
Yeah.
So, I understand exactly. That is a big frustration.
Yeah.
We experience.
Yeah, and I can see that. I worked 5-6 years in public education, so I've seen that as well. And I think that's a huge, it's a whole nother talk, maybe kind of like discipline and school settings and things like that. But I think just they got to pay the price. The consequences there, recognize, and then, but how do you support somebody to pay their dues, take the consequence, learn from it, and then again, not internalize that as shame? It's kind of the key there. Anything else? We're still good on time, so.
Is there some kind of test or way to track how different groups of people are on these various levels? For example, would homeschool kids, as generally speaking, be more self-actualized than public school kids, or the other way around? Would a certain race of kids be more or less than other races, income levels? So is there some kind of test or survey or some kind of thing where you can track and look at bigger pictures to see income levels have a really strong impact in this, or this does, or that does?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not aware of any single test for Maslow's hierarchy, but each one of these levels will have, there are instruments and surveys and things that can be used to assess those. So for example, just starting with self-actualization, there will be surveys, there are surveys that are out there that can give you a degree of self-actualization that person has on different dimensions. There are a lot of surveys on, for example, esteem. So just all the things that are contained within that esteem level. So identity development, self-esteem, self-concept, there are instruments and surveys that you can have related to that. In terms of the different demographics, I'm not familiar with the specific research, but I can anticipate that, for example, but again, there are a lot of confounding factors. So if you're homeschooled, there are a lot of other things that are going on. Most likely your home life is pretty good if you're homeschooled. Not always, but I would say maybe that's not the case. But you're probably getting a lot of support at home then. In terms of that gets then into like identity development. If two, for example, religiously homeschooled children, there's an identity type called foreclosure, where it is you formed your identity, but you haven't really explored who you are individually as a person. So they're raised in this strict, possibly religious environment. They internalize that identity, but have done so without actually exploring themselves and their own identity. Yeah. So I could see within these there are surveys, and I would expect to see different demographics.
And then generally speaking, if you have, let's say, 3 children in a home, and they all have the same parents or lack of parents, or the same, the same experience or whatever, would generally speaking all 3 be similar on this, or would they just be completely unique? And even though all the variables are pretty much the same, would the children react differently? Is there any connection to these things, or is it more just random variance?
Yep, that's a really good question too. I think in terms of personality types and how they might respond to those environments, outside of like a Cinderella story where you have a child who's just clearly mistreated, I think personality definitely could play a role in this. We know that, even when it just comes to things like self-esteem and self-concept, they're going to be just, innate personality factors that go into that. I would say that for the most part, you could expect a healthy, positive home environment to correlate with self-actualization for all of those students. And again, if there is a certain psychological disorder, chemical disorder, something like that, that then could be a cause of, and really it's going to happen at those that esteem, because really the esteem and self-actualization levels that are really the human levels, because it's like, elephants need the physiological safety and even the love and belonging. But when it comes to esteem and self-actualization, those are really human elements. And that esteem would start when we get into identity, shame and guilt, and then things like that.
So this is probably going to be really convoluted. He was talking about homeschool groups, and then you talked about having an identity of self, but not really exploring who you are yet. And that made me think of a friend that was raised really religious, that once he was removed from that environment and he was in college, he kind of had like an identity crisis.
Yep.
And he was like, yes, I am this religion, but is this actually my religion? Sort of thing. And so then I started thinking about midlife crises, which often happen, where you've been in this role for so long, and then you start thinking about retirement, your kids are grown up and they move out, and all of a sudden that identity, you're kind of removed from it. So like, who are you? Yep. I think we could see this with our children too, because they're in an environment that's part of who their identity, but they haven't explored self. Yep. They're removed from that environment, and all of a sudden they're just kind of grasping, trying to figure out who they are. And I imagine it causes a lot of disruptions in behavior.
Yeah. And the research on it really, so that foreclosure identity, the people who form the identity without really exploring, as long as they can stay in that environment, they're going to be much happier than the typical person in the world. So that they actually tend to be very happy and healthy and live their life. But it's going to be a very narrow life. So the other states are moratorium, where you have sort of shed the identity constructs that you were raised with, and sort of now you're exploring different identities, things like that. That's moratorium. And then achievement is if you've explored and then arrived at sense of who you are. That's achievement. And then diffusion is just, you don't care. You're just depressed, don't care, don't have any desire to form an identity or be anybody or do anything. And children can go, we go back and forth between, in adolescence too, those different states. They're not stages, typically not stages, it's states. And then two, it can be sort of domain dependent. So like there could be that kid who gets on the soccer field and they know exactly who they are. They're the team captain, they're the soccer player, and they are comfortable in that environment with the soccer team, traveling, playing soccer, doing that stuff. But then they get into the classroom or they get to the church event and they're lost, things like that. So it can be quite domain dependent in terms of that identity development.
So when you have a, not uncommon, I think, with some of my cases is that, especially in a teenage group, because they have been removed from their, albeit bad environment, but it's what they knew. And they made it place to place to place. And so when they have found, they seek out sometimes the most unhealthiest identity. They tend to gravitate toward that group because they may have changed schools longer time, but when they go to a school, I've had a child and they seem to gravitate to the troublemakers or they would not gravitate. So
yeah,
I kind of struggled with how to, without shaming or anything,
yeah.
that's to try to steer that, because that was a repetitive thing of identity they did gravitate to was so negative on each.
That's a really important insight. And I think it all goes back to that desire for in-group, that fear of being ostracized, because any group you're in, there are certain requirements that they're going to have to meet. And I think that even probably ties in to some shame issues too. I'm not the good grades kid. I'm not the, I'm not the do good kid. I'm not the successful kid. And I think, again, that could be kind of tied in with shame because they've internalized that. That's who they are. And so then there's really this fear to even try to switch groups, because if I mess up, I'm going to get kicked out. I'll be, ostracized from the tribe. So it's, so I think kind of, it would be, I think really to address that, would require therapy, because I think it's pretty deep. It goes into their identity, who they are. You have to kind of get to the root. Where's that shame coming from? Where are those beliefs coming from? And then slowly, step by step, get them to see themselves, their own self-concept, as being somebody who could even do that. They're not going to even try if they think it's impossible. So yeah, that's a really good point too.
And is there a specific therapy that would revolve around that specific?
I'm not sure. Yeah. But a therapist will know. Yeah.
But on a surface level, we do the best we can because that's our goal. Is number one, we have their confidence, and on the surface level, obviously a lot of our kids are in therapy already.
Yeah.
But it's to just try to encourage that their own identity doesn't have to go there.
And I don't know if there may be examples, like having stories of people who had rough upbringings and changed or things like that. I mean, maybe that could help, just something for them to model and see that, we've all done things, and that doesn't need to define who we are, and we can change, and we choose our lives at any point.
So taking a kid and putting them in front of a presidential podium and photographing them and telling them this is what you could be one day.
Yeah. This is oddly specific, I think.
I wanted to add though that sometimes it starts with us looking for those little minute things they did right.
Yes.
Because the only things that have been pointed out to them are the things they've done wrong. And you have to build on something.
Yep.
And maybe it's, look, you haven't been suspended in a week.
Yeah.
or whatever, but you have to start somewhere and be the one that finds that little speck of good that they can hold on to.
Yeah, and I think that is so important. And really what it is, it's just this idea of like being beyond remediation or beyond correction. We're not trying to fix you. We're not, you're not broken. But that's exactly it. If you can find that thing, what are they really good at? What is that one interest they have? And whatever it is, help them build on that. Because if they can, most things in life, you'll find the community of people, who are into it. So yeah, I think that's really important. You guys don't need me here. You can just come and talk and share your. Okay. Anything else for a little neuroscience? Okay. If there is, feel free. We can go back. So I'll throw some numbers at you. We have between 86 and 100 billion neurons in our brains. We, as humans, we really can't comprehend the number billion. It's 1,000 millions. At the same time, a neuron can have thousands of connections, synapses. Okay, we see the biology textbook. It'll be like a neuron, and it has maybe like 5 connections, synapses. No, neurons can have up to like 15,000. A single neuron can have up to 15,000 connections. So we have just in our neocortex, so we have our subcortical region, which is our like limbic and emotional systems, and then our neocortex, which is the outer layer, it can have about 150 trillion neocortical synapses. Now, a 3-month fetus, nerve cells proliferate at a rate of about 15 million per hour. So somebody can check my math on this, but at that rate, it'd be about 277 days to get to 100 billion. So it's from 3 months until, and actually we develop new neurons throughout our entire lives. There was this myth that we don't build new neurons. That's not true. We do. But the point is, once we get older, they're almost at negligible rates. When you're talking about going from 15 million per hour to a couple dozen, it's not comparable. So here's something again that most people aren't aware of. Our brains first make an overabundance of synapses in infancy and then again in late childhood. So we make more connections than we're ever going to use. And synaptic pruning, the removal of those connections during early childhood and adolescence, there's 2 specific times that this happens, can be at rates of up to 30,000 per second. So you're losing about 30,000 connections per second. Okay. So here's how this connects. So there's this myth that learning is about making new neural connections. The reality is that most learning is the result of maintaining the used synapses and pruning away the ones you don't use. So the brain's sort of default state is just have everything connected. And then anything you don't use, that gets pruned away, and you just maintain and strengthen the ones that you use. So use it or lose it. If you use the neurons, or you will lose them. And this gives us this idea of experience expectant states. So again, there are these 2 major pruning events that happen. The first is in early childhood, and then the second one is in adolescence, starting with puberty. And so the first one, so the idea of an experience expectant state is that the human brain expects certain experiences at that time. So the way that it's removing neurons, it's expecting to develop certain things at that time. And if it's not developed at that time, it will always be deficient. So it doesn't mean there can't be remediation to improve, but it will never be where it could have been had it been developed at that time. So that 0 to 4 years old, language development, and then those secure attachments. And that's really all the way until puberty. But the major pruning event happens in that 0 to 4 years old. So the absolute most important thing, and I have a daughter who will be 3 in about a week, actually, and another one who's 5 months old. The thing we do the most with her and my other one is just talk to them. We are just constantly talking to them, having them see words. We're working on reading with my daughter right now. Language development is really the key from that 0 to 4 years old. Puberty, the second major pruning event, this opportunity that you're only going to get once. If you don't develop these things at that time, you'll always have that deficiency, is social, emotional, and cognitive integration. And that's really the key. So what do I mean by that? In children, the way the brain communicates is based on location. So neurons in the front communicate with neurons in the front, neurons in the back communicate with neurons in the back. And as you develop through adolescence, you start using different areas of the brain in conjunction with one another. So you'll use, for example, your emotional areas and connect those to your rational areas and connect those with your language areas. And so then the brain stops communicating just based on location and starts communicating based on function. So emotions get connected to rational thoughts and self-control and things like that. And language is a big part of that too, being able to articulate those things and make sense of those things. So that's really what puberty is all about. Puberty is about that, making those connections between the social, emotional, and cognitive processes in the brain. And if they don't get that experience during adolescence, there'll always be that deficiency for the rest of their lives. You can do remediation, you can do things to help get to more, I'll say, typical levels, but it'll never be what it could have been had they had those experiences. So adolescence is really about creating those experiences for them, giving them that opportunity to work in groups, be social, connect with peers, connect with adults, and regulate their emotions, connect their emotions to meaningful things and their rational thoughts, and being able to use their emotions rationally and for information and things like that. Any questions on any of that? I think this is a really key thing, because again, it's the fact that this is a one-time chance type thing. It's like if you don't get that language exposure between 0 and 4, it's too late.
How do you define adolescence? Like, is it age related, hormone related?
Personally, hormone related. Yeah. So this is a debate in psychology.
Sure.
Nobody has a great definition. The best one that I've heard of is that and this can be controversial, but you enter adulthood when you're responsible for the life of someone else. So this is just a purely biological sort of explanation. So after puberty, most species are responsible for caring for their offspring, and things like that. In humans, so again, we kind of have to, if we're going to define it that way, somebody who doesn't have children, does that mean they're an adolescent the rest of their life? It's like, well, they can. I see that's kind of a good thing. I'm raising kids right now. My brother and his wife are pregnant. They told us the news a few months ago, and I was just like, oh, big mistake. You guys you have no idea what you're in for, and I was literally thinking to have a talk with them, after raising kids now, I see how you could be happy not having kids, how you could live that life, But anyway, that was kind of a tangent. But in terms of adolescence, really from a biological perspective, it actually starts very early. So gonadotrophy and things like that start even for females, you're looking 7, 8 years old, and then puberty will about 11, 12 years old. By that time, they're in puberty is in full swing, there are a lot of hormonal changes that happen and will direct cognitive development and things like that at that time. So personally, I like to think of it as a biological state, sort of encouraged by hormones and things like that. But then there's the social and cultural component that, again, like I said, we're in our current culture, we really have an abnormally extended adolescence into our late 20s. And that's actually a little bit more consistent with the biology. The biology of adolescence, in terms of the development and the pruning and stuff that's happening, that actually does continue through late 20s. Yeah.
So it's too late for the rest of us.
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, and like I said, it can start really early, especially for females. They're going to be about two years earlier than males. And so you're looking at by the time 10, 11, teenage years, really teenage years is a good rough estimate.
Is there any situational relationship? Like a lot of our children are in a situation that we call parentification.
Okay.
That, you know, they have essentially assumed more of a parent role to their siblings and sometimes even their parents. So could being in that situation and possibly having like some related stress hormones and stuff cause this hormonal adolescence to occur sooner, that they might start losing or establishing those social, emotional, cognitive connections and losing connections sooner than what we would expect from like biological, physiological development?
That's a really good, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if, like the social cultural environment could actually, I think what you're asking kind of, could it actually stimulate a biological change? I wouldn't be surprised if it could. I'm not sure. What I would say though is that currently in certain environments, children are very ready to take on adult responsibilities. And I would argue that they're ready to take on adult responsibilities much sooner than we give them to them. And another aspect of this is that for healthy development, they need to take on those responsibilities because it's sort of like, again, use it or lose it. If they're not, and I think a lot of even the behavior issues we see and things like that is because we're treating adolescents like children. Adolescence is training for adulthood. You need to be giving them adult responsibilities in an environment where they can make that authentic mistake and not suffer catastrophic consequences. But they need to be taking on those adult roles by adolescents, really.
Because the groups that we work with, the idea of adult role can be a lot more than what we might think. Because when I think of adult role, I think, okay, you do your own laundry, you wash your own dishes sort of thing. But our kids might be in adult roles of cooking and feeding and cleaning everything for this child. So what would you define as like adult responsibilities?
Yeah, and I think in terms of that, like those actual aspects of that in themselves are not detrimental. So in adolescence or even an older child, having to do those responsibilities in and of themselves is not detrimental. It can be positive. If it's happening at the expense of other things that we're expecting developmentally, whether it's schoolwork and things like that, then that's where the problem is going to be. But I would say in terms of like that, it's in terms of the specific, that in itself is not necessarily detrimental. Still good on time. We can bring it all together here. So really just some main takeaways for you. So deficiency at any level of the hierarchy will hinder self-actualization. And being in a state of self-actualization is important for all stages of development. It's not the goal of adulthood. It's important from birth up through adulthood, being in that state of self-actualization if you're looking to optimize the health and happiness of an individual. Experience expectant states create these critical periods of development. So again, about 0 to 4 for language development, and then teenage years for social, emotional, and cognitive integration. And so I would argue that 2 exceptionally important critical periods are early childhood and adolescence.
I'm sorry. Don't you think that even in the 0 to 4 age group, that they're also learning psychological?
Absolutely, and that goes to that attachment theory stuff is really important there. So it's that psychological stuff that happens there will reemerge in adolescence. So it's sort of one aspect of it, I guess, and I hadn't thought of this before. It's kind of like you get a second chance in adolescence to maybe correct some of those things, but so it's really that language development, I would say, is going to be that thing that if you don't get it, then you'll always be deficient in it. But there are certainly, there are really, really important psychological and social things that are happening 0 to 4, but I would say primarily connected with attachment theory and just having your needs met being comfortable feeling the emotions that you're feeling and things like that. That's everything. That's all I have. Thank you so much. Really insightful.
If anybody wants to do a deeper dive in this, do you have any published studies or resources you would recommend?
I, not on this particular subject. I could send you some stuff. I don't have anything off the top of my head, but I will definitely send you some stuff that would be relevant.
Okay.